a male Iktachi born on the farthest moon of Iktach. Saesee Tiin was a hard-bitten Jedi Master who ascended to the Jedi Council in the decades preceding the Battle of Yavin. Noted as a gifted telepath and the second greatest pilot of his era, Saesee Tiin was involved in such notable conflicts as the Yin Chori Uprising and the Battle of Geonosis, the latter of which ushering in the Clone Wars. Becoming a general in the Republic's clone army, Tiin's piloting skills saw him to victory on such battlefronts as Rendil and Coruscant itself. When Chancellor Palpatine had been ousted as the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, Tiin would accompany Jedi Master Mace Windu in an attempt to wrest control of the Republic away from the Sith. Saesee Tiin was killed in the ensuing engagement, beheaded by Darth Sidious after the latter had tricked the Jedi Master into lowering his guard in an attempt to read his mind. A male Nautolan born on the watery world of Glee Ansem. Kit Fisto was a renowned Jedi Master descended from the noted Jedi Terraskaze Master Niad Fisto. Distinguishing himself at the Battle of Geonosis, Fisto was named to the Jedi Council after the really lame death of Jedi Council Master Coleman Trebor. Shoehorned into military service as a general in the Republic's clone army, Fisto led his troops to victory on such notable battlefronts as Mon Calamari and Ord Cestus, surviving engagements with the infamous Jedi killers Asajj Ventress and General Grievous. In 19 BBY, Fisto would also be among the Jedi chosen by Mace Windu to accompany him in his attempts to arrest Sidious. While the Nautolan Jedi Master managed to outperform two of his contemporaries, he too was ultimately killed in the ensuing battle, ironically also beheaded by the Sith Lord. Or cleaved through the stomach, depending on which version you go by. First, we will compare their physical attributes. Saesee Tiin was a male Iktachi, the scariest, most vile, spine-chilling, nerve-wracking, horrifying species to ever walk the face of the galaxy, who appeared to be in his mid to late 40s. The Iktachi were a race of humanoids noted for their above-average physical strength and high pain threshold, traits that Saesee took full advantage of in the development of his heavy-handed fighting style. They were further distinguished by their large hands, sharp teeth, and two large down-curved cranial horns that served as an expression of their aggressive nature. In order to survive the violent winds of their homeworld, the Iktachi species developed a high resistance towards environmental hazards. Saesee Tiin himself has even been noted for surviving in various environments, from intense heat to raging storms. The Iktachi also possessed sensory organs that gifted them with extremely potent telepathic abilities, a trait that was further enhanced by Tiin's force sensitivity. Ugh. Yeah, just a side note, of all the crazy species that could be found in the Star Wars universe, Iktachi freak me out the most. I don't know why, but there's just something about downward curving horns that just gets me. And the eyes. Oh god, the eyes. Kit Fisto was a male Nautolan who appeared to be in his late 30s to early 40s. Native to the ocean world of Glee Ansem, Nautolans were a race of amphibious humanoids noted for possessing quicker reflexes and a moderately higher level of constitution than humans. And Fisto was an exception to neither. His quicker reflexes aided in the execution of his dynamic fighting style, while his higher constitution made him far more resilient than a majority of his fellow Jedi. As a Nautolan, Kit Fisto possessed the ability to breathe underwater for what appeared to be an indefinite period of time, and unlike other aquatic species, could operate at near peak physical capability when on land. The species was further distinguished by their generally green-hued complexion, low-level night vision, and an assemblage of head tentacles protruding from the back of their scalps. As noted in the new Essential Guide to Alien Species, these tentacles were sensory organs that granted them the ability to read the emotional state of those in their vicinity by attuning themselves to the pheromone levels of a desired target. The benefits of these growths even extended into the Nautolan's ability to function on land, as they would enhance their baseline senses such as smell and touch to help their bodies adjust to their foreign environment. This conclusion is pretty simple to decide. Kit Fisto is tough, but Saesee Tiin is built like a tank. Both may hail from vastly different species with their own unique set of attributes. However, there is a lot of canceling out when we consider the effectiveness of these traits in a no-holds-barred duel to the death. Tiin may possess greater telepathic ability than Kit. However, such an advantage has little effect in a contest between two beings capable of bolstering those same attributes through the Force. Similarly, as the basic assumption behind all my videos is that both combatants are being dropped cold into an even battlefield, this means that Fisto's ability to breathe underwater is negligible. Kit's ability to sense the pheromone levels of a desired target wouldn't factor in here either, as its effect on the contest would be minimal. Whereas Saesee Tiin's greater levels of physical strength and hardiness would have quite a dramatic effect. While the Nautolan Jedi Master is no pushover, he would be soundly outperformed in a physical sense by his adversary. So accordingly, Saesee Tiin gets the physical edge. Ugh. Now we compare them as martial artists and lightsaber duelists. Drafting a comprehensive analysis for Saesee Tiin is difficult, as the character has only been depicted in a few fights against blaster-wielding adversaries, and has otherwise been placed behind the cockpit of a starfighter or negated to the background for the majority of his appearances. His participation in the showdown on Coruscant has been the only time the Jedi Master has been observed in a serious lightsaber duel with an opposing Force wielder. However, we cannot use this duel as any indication of his martial prowess due to the existential circumstances that were at play, which I will get into later. As such, a number of assumptions will have to be made regarding his conduct in a fair lightsaber duel with an opposing Force wielder. He was proclaimed a master of lightsaber combat by his fellow council master, Shaak Ti. While Shaak Ti is noted as a dedicated combat enthusiast, meaning her praise would carry a great deal of weight, this is a vague designation, as Saesee Tiin lives in an era of great lightsaber masters. Saesee's chosen martial arts discipline was Form 5 lightsaber combat, specifically the Dejem So style. Developed in answer to the perceived offensive deficiencies of Sarisu, Form 5 was built around the tactic of following up defensive maneuvers with immediate offensive counters, seizing the initiative rather than passively responding to an opponent's actions. Unlike the Xi'an variant of Form 5, which was designed with blast deflection as its primary focus, Dejem So was optimized for use primarily in lightsaber dueling. While it lacked the strong technical focus of its brother, true masters of Dejem So were considered to be on par with Jedi battle masters due to the versatile nature of their techniques. Whether engaging swaths of criminals or battle droids, Saesee Tiin's offensive blade work was direct and to the point, based around rapidly executed power attacks and aggressive full-body movements that allowed him to bring his strength-oriented Djemso moves to bear. When on the defensive, he was an expert with blast deflection, often using targeted deflection to redirect shots back at shooters. While the nature of his performance against blaster-wielding enemies is clear, how Tiin would fare in a serious lightsaber duel with another trained Force wielder requires some conjecture. As I've mentioned previously, Tiin's showings against Palpatine cannot be used as an accurate gauge for his level of performance, due to the circumstances surrounding it. While the film version of Revenge of the Sith depicts Saesee being struck down almost immediately to demonstrate Palpatine's power, the novelization of Revenge of the Sith provides a more sensible version of his death. In the novel, Tiin is still struck down not long after the duel begins. However, this only happened because Sidious tricked the Iktachi into attempting to read his mind, which caused him to lower his guard and leave himself susceptible to the Dark Lord's attack.
How can I be any threat to you? He turned desperately to Saesee Tiin. Master Tiin, you're the telepath. What am I thinking right now? Tiin frowned and cocked his head. His blade dipped. A smear of red flashing darkness hurtled from behind the desk. Saesee Tiin's head bounced when it hit the floor.
Describing himself as a meticulous, broadsword style of fighter whose greatest asset was his strength, I would say the best way to describe Saesee's style of dueling would be something akin to Darth Malgus light. This would mean that his offensive technique would be based around overwhelming adversaries through superior strength and power, while his defensive would be grounded in stonewalling assailants while working in his own counters. However, despite this somewhat belligerent style of fighting, Tiin was not some barbarian hefting a cudgel, hence the Darth Malgus light remark. And it's clear to see that his technique was not lacking for technical sophistication or restraint. The best example of this mindset can be seen during his skirmish with a group of criminals on Diodo in the early months of the Clone Wars. After being immobilized by a speeder's cable and thought dead, the Jedi Master took advantage of his assailant's distraction by jumping up and creating a loop in the cable, wrapping it around one of their necks, thereby causing the group to panic and order their leader to speed off, which in turn choked out the criminal whom Tiin had tied up. The Jedi Master then proceeded to wrap the cable around a pole, causing the driver to crash, then proceeded to free himself by snapping the cable to pieces by flexing. A brutal strategy to be sure, but also a highly intuitive and varied tactic that demonstrates his combative ingenuity. While not ranked among the reigning Djemso masters of his day, nor utilizing a personalized technique that distinguished him from other practitioners of his chosen style, Saesee Tiin was still a highly effective and lethal lightsaber duelist. Possessing an excellent understanding of the properties adherent to his chosen style, and applying it in a manner that effectively covered his bases. And now we move to Kit Fisto, who has been much more heavily featured and whose skills as a lightsaber duelist have been much more thoroughly explored and detailed. Similar to Saesee Tiin, Kit Fisto was also noted as a master of lightsaber combat by many of his peers. However, just like with Tiin, this is a vague designation due to the era in which he lived. Fisto's preferred martial arts discipline was Form 1 lightsaber combat, the Shi-Cho style. The first lightsaber form ever developed, and the foundation from which all other forms were built, Form 1 was the tutorial style of the Jedi Order and was exceedingly simple in both its blade work and its disciplines. Also known as the Way of the Sarlacc, Shi-Cho emphasized the use of broad, sweeping strikes focused in on the humanoid body's target zones, which left practitioners of the style well suited for engagements with large groups of assailants. The fundamental disciplines of Form 1 was for an initiate to allow the Force to flow through him, guiding his actions. A useful skill for fledgling Jedi Padawans looking to develop their combat skills, to be sure. But when taken to the absolute nth degree, the style became something very different. Advanced masters of Shi-Cho would completely release themselves into the currents of the Force, resulting in a wild and emotionally charged fighting style that relied heavily on randomized offensive swordplay. Wild, raw, and emotionally driven, Form 1 could pose just as much of a danger to an initiate's psychological stability as could the study of Form 7. For these reasons, practitioners of the art would have to constantly keep themselves under control so as not to be swept up in the currents of their emotions. A mentality that appears to be the underlying facet behind Kit Fisto's overall approach. Identifying himself as a humble servant of the light, Fisto knew that his specialization in Shi-Cho placed him at greater risk, but his sense of duty made it worthwhile. He anchored one foot in the darkness in order to stand against it. Described as a living martial hurricane when fighting in an offensive posture, Fisto's personal technique was strong and dynamic, combining aggressive hack-and-slash blade work with mind-numbing speed and agility. However, he tempered this emotional storm with a relentless level of refinement, bringing a moderate level of precision to an otherwise randomized and chaotic fighting style. Considering that Shi-Cho placed a heavy emphasis on blast deflection as a training tool, it should come as no surprise that Fisto was an expert at employing this tactic, easily batting aside blaster bolts and, on a few occasions, performing targeted deflection. As far as his knowledge of alternative fighting techniques goes, he has shown exceptional skill in the field of Jar-Kai dual-blade fencing, such as when he fought against General Grievous and his Magna Guards on the third moon of Visak, and he was also an expert at unarmed combat, having been observed incapacitating numerous thugs with force-enhanced physical strikes alone, and effectively integrating them into his lightsaber technique when necessary. In my view, Kit Fisto's personal take on Shi-Cho very much reflected his aquatic heritage. Rather than the linear attack and defend style of fighting adopted by many of his contemporaries, Fisto's was a radical ebb and flow attack pattern, relying on speed-based attack flurries to overwhelm his adversaries, while using acrobatic evasions to simultaneously evade and bypass an opponent's attack and strike out at an exposed flank. However, despite his incredibly high level of refinement and skill, Fisto was not exempt from the shortcomings adherent to his chosen style. As the style was developed in an era where nearly all engagements were limited to large cabals of criminals and thugs rather than anyone else, Shi-Cho was not oriented for combat against a single well-trained opponent equipped with a lightsaber. More than once, Kit Fisto has been observed carving his way through hordes of assailants with negligible difficulty. However, his emphasis on this approach stemmed from his own inability to handle a head-to-head engagement with beings of equal or greater skill. Many point to Fisto's duel with Grievous as evidence that he overcame this shortcoming. However, one need only look more closely at that fight, as well as the logistics adherent to General Grievous's personal style. Grievous's technique was a randomized, multi-angular offensive based around unpredictable attack vectors and aggressive flourishing motions that have been repeatedly noted as feeling as though one is fighting against a large division of assailants. Exactly the kind of offensive that Fisto is optimized towards dealing with. By contrast, when he found himself squaring off against Asajj Ventress, he was outmaneuvered and defeated. While a number of factors contributed to Ventress's victory over the Jedi Master, Fisto himself noted the hindrances his style had placed on him. As his duel with Darth Sidious proved, when put between a rock and a hard place with no way out, he crumbled under the pressure. However, this weakness, serious though it may be, should not be seen as detracting from Fisto's overall combat effectiveness. He is a highly skilled and varied lightsaber duelist, whose skills and accomplishments mark him as one of the best of his era. A true force to be reckoned with, and not to be underestimated. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this verdict, I must stress that Saesee Tiin's level of performance against Darth Sidious versus Fisto's is not a clear indication of Fisto's superiority over Tiin as a martial artist, due to the Iktachi Master's defeat coming through trickery rather than skill. Judging a character's level of performance by how they fared against the same adversary without looking at the logistics adherent to their chosen styles is unreliable and, quite frankly, lazy. It's the same sort of BS ABC logic that so many people on various battle boards love to rely on. Well, I definitely touched a few nerves by saying that, so let's move on before I get spammed any further, shall we? As far as their personal fighting styles go, the greatest advantage of both Saesee Tiin and Kit Fisto was their general purpose, well-rounded level of competence. Possessing a highly refined level of understanding regarding the styles they employed, which made them fair competition for even the great masters of their era. However, both attained this level of competence along radically different lines. True to his own word, Saesee Tiin was very much a broadsword style of fighter, his favorite offensive tactic being little more than a straightforward attempt to overwhelm his opponent's defenses. That being said, he still demonstrated considerable levels of restraint and creativity in his combat tactics, balancing out the ruthless aggression of a tactless berserker with the strategic ingenuity of a true Jedi Master. By contrast, Kit Fisto was more of a, well, I hesitate to call him a spastic style of fighter, as he was actually quite dynamic and innovative. However, his breadth of skill was based around releasing himself into the Force and riding its currents in a randomized, emotionally charged frenzy, foregoing singular thought and becoming a personification of its destructive fury. Similar to the duel between Darth Malgus and Ven Zalo, what we have here is a contest between a linear strength-oriented power duelist and a radical speed fencer. Saesee Tiin's raw power versus Kit Fisto's agile speed. And just like with Malgus and Zalo, neither fighting technique was ultimately rendered more viable than the other, with true victory coming down to which combatant was more skilled in applying his personal approach. While the feats of pure skill we've witnessed Kit Fisto display is far above what Saesee Tiin has been subjected to, I hesitate to give him an advantage in this field, as Tiin has only had a handful of combative showings, and we haven't seen him truly push to his limits. So there's no telling where he stands relative to Fisto in this area. Another factor to consider is Kit's weakness against single opponents with skill levels greater than or equal to his own. Since it's difficult to judge where Saesee stands in comparison to Fisto as a pure martial artist, it is equally difficult to deduce whether or not Tiin is on the level where Fisto would be experiencing major difficulties engaging him in one-on-one combat. Due to the large amounts of ambiguity surrounding their respective level of skill in comparison to one another, I declare Saesee Tiin and Kit Fisto equals as martial artists and lightsaber duelists. Now we compare their force abilities. As I mentioned in my previous video, the basic prerequisite for being named to the Jedi Council is a deep philosophical understanding and interpretation of the Force. As such, Saesee Tiin obviously held a stronger connection to the Force than the majority of Jedi of his era. While not as overwhelmingly powerful or as creative and fluid in his use of the Force as many of his contemporaries, he was a capable combative Force wielder in his own right, taking the basic Force techniques common to all Jedi and elevating them to the master level. While he demonstrated the enhanced agility and speed common to all Jedi, he was most notable for his enhanced strength and endurance, to the point where he was capable of snapping a steel cable by flexing and enduring being dragged around while tied to a speeder. This emphasis on strength and power carried over to his combative applications of telekinesis, with even his most casual force pushes and shoves being capable of staggering an opponent. He used force grips for the precise manipulation of objects, being able to lift extremely heavy objects with little effort, and further refining it into force throw, which became one of Tiin's primary combative skills. During the Battle of Iktoch, Saesee Tiin and Master Windu participated in a friendly contest of strength to see who could throw a super battle droid the furthest with the Force, which culminated in their combined force push, launching a droid 132 meters in the air before plummeting to the surface. During the same conflict, Tiin used the Force to catch and reverse a homing missile that had been fired at him by a B-3 heavy super battle droid, a demonstration of telekinetic skill that Mace Windu, a noted telekinetic savant of his era, marked as highly impressive. Shortly thereafter, Saesee used an advanced application of force grip to lift and throw an IG-227 Hailfire class droid tank at the aforementioned super battle droid. Possessing extremely advanced psychic abilities that were further augmented by his Iktochi physiology, Saesee Tiin, along with the likes of Jedi Master Yarael Poof, was considered one of the finest telepaths of his day, being fluent in various forms of conventional and esoteric forms of mental manipulation. Employing the basic mind trick with casual ease, he was able to compel weak-willed subjects to do his bidding, and on a few occasions outright erasing knowledge of his own existence. Additionally, Saesee has also utilized instinctive astrogation, essentially using his telepathic powers to chart and navigate through hyperspace. As far as his knowledge of more esoteric force abilities goes, he possessed no facility with energy-based force powers or force magics, and there has never been any indication as whether or not he could effectively defend against such attacks. Saesee Tiin advocated for the straightforward approach in both lightsaber combat and force abilities. And while this approach had its benefits, it ultimately came at the expense of a more diverse skill set. As a Clone Wars-era Jedi consular, Kit Fisto was a Force wielder first and foremost, and was noted as one of the most powerful and varied Jedi Masters of his day. His application of Force-based physical augmentation was mainly geared towards enhancing his speed and agility to aid in the execution of his personal fighting style. Telekinesis was one of Kit Fisto's primary skills, and he made heavy combative use of it. On the basic level, he has employed powerful force pushes and pulls to blast or push desired targets in the midst of combat, and he was also able to lift and manipulate extremely heavy objects with relative ease. An expert at integrating these powers into his lightsaber sequences, he preferred using them to off-balance and stagger his opponents, which furthered his control of the fight. While Fisto had a tendency to preach restraint in his use of telekinesis, he was by no means afraid to rely on overwhelming force to get the job done. He has been observed brushing aside missiles and guiding them into the path of several oncoming droids. And during the Battle of Rishi in 22 BBY, he used the Force to violently snap the neck of a Geonosian warrior, killing him instantly. While such insidious applications of telekinesis were rare, such levels of precision really speak volumes regarding the level of control Fisto has achieved. As a telepath, Kit was capable, but nothing to write home about. He was versed in the basic mind trick, and appeared to possess a limited facility with Force concealment, which allowed him to mask his Force signature from other adepts, though it's never been established whether or not he could cloak himself from beings who were actively trying to seek him out. Moving away from these rather conventional Jedi powers, Fisto possessed no aptitude with energy-based Force abilities or Force magics of any sort. And like Saesee Tiin, it's never been established whether or not he could effectively defend against such manners of attack. However, Kit Fisto did possess several powers that went beyond what was commonly associated with followers of the Jedi Order. When operating in an undersea environment, he was able to use the Force to manipulate water currents and compress them into a tight beam that could be directed towards a desired target. He even developed his own unique Force ability, the Force Water Orb, essentially a giant telekinetically reinforced bubble. The orb functioned on a similar principle to that of kinetite, a gathered burst of telekinetic energy capable of ripping through durasteel when thrown. While the nature of these abilities required Fisto to be operating in a specialized environment in order to be effectively utilized, the fact that he could use them at all is indicative of extremely advanced skill and power. And in my view, Kit Fisto's Force abilities shared several parallels with those of Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was an exceedingly powerful combative Force wielder who made up for his lack of variety with creativity and control, taking the powers he did possess and becoming an expert with them, and fluidly incorporating them into his overall combative technique, improving his overall combative viability. I find this one relatively simple to call. However, I will of course elaborate so no one misunderstands the reality of the verdict. There is very little to say regarding Tiin's and Fisto's use of Force-based physical augmentation, as both are able to enhance their physical capabilities to aid in the execution of their personal fighting styles. While the magnitude of Tiin's combative applications of telekinesis were impressive, his demonstrated methods were extremely simple and blunt, his telekinetic attacks being completely devoid of subtlety or creativity, essentially a light-side Darth Bane. In contrast, Fisto's Force abilities were both awe-inspiring in their magnitude and were a fully fledged and fluidly incorporated tactical and strategic tool that he used to control a battle. He may have exercised restraint, but not at the expense of his combative viability, boasting a greater array of combative powers, which in turn spoke to a much higher affinity for the Force. While Saesee obviously possessed a far greater level of potency and skill than Fisto as a telepath, such an advantage would do little, as most telepathic abilities are useless in a confrontation between two Force wielders trained to resist such influence. And unlike Jarl Poof, Tiin has never shown any skill in the ones that aren't. When analyzing and comparing the Force abilities of Saesee Tiin and Kit Fisto, Saesee Tiin falls short in literally every category. His magnitude is matched and surpassed. His telepathic powers are moot. His fluidity and creativity does not compare. As such, I award Kit Fisto the edge as a Force wielder. Now we compare their weaponry. Saesee Tiin wielded a standard lightsaber with a green blade, likely fitted with an Adagan and/or Kyber crystal as the focusing lens. While some sources depict Tiin wielding a blue lightsaber, this should be treated as a relatively minor continuity error and nothing more. As noted in Lightsabers, A Guide to the Weapons of the Force, the ridged section on the upper half of the hilt was designed to accommodate a two-handed fighting style, which makes sense as this is a fighting method that Djem So provides specialist training in. Similarly, Kit Fisto wielded a standard lightsaber that was fitted with two green-hued Adagan crystals as the focusing lens. Ironically, there have also been sources that have falsely depicted Fisto's weapon with a blue blade. Apparently, green and blue are easily construed by some people, despite them being on different sections of the color wheel. As noted in the aforementioned Lightsabers, A Guide to the Weapons of the Force, Fisto equipped his lightsaber with flashback water seals that allowed it to function underwater, a design aesthetic that would be adopted by many Jedi of his era. Truthfully, the only reason I even bothered to compare their weaponry was to talk about the underwater functionality of Fisto's, a design aesthetic that wouldn't even be a factor on an even battlefield. Both employ standard lightsabers, with the only advantage being their familiarity with their functionality. No edge will be given for weaponry. And now, the verdict. There are a great many thematic and technical similarities between a hypothetical battle between Saesee Tiin and Kit Fisto, and the broadsword versus rapier dialogue between Saesee Tiin and Mace Windu. Master Tiin is the broadsword, a cunning warrior who defines himself by his immense strength and power, whose main tactic revolves around honing in on a target, then deliberately smashing through all obstacles in his way to get to it. Kit Fisto is the rapier, a dynamic, speed-oriented fighter whose main tactic revolves around dancing circles around his adversaries to further his control of the fight. Just as neither fundamental discipline is inherently superior to the other, so too are their skills as martial artists and lightsaber duelists. Due to the ambiguity surrounding the exact caliber of Saesee Tiin's skills, there is no way of knowing whether or not he would be sufficient enough to take advantage of Saesee's weakness against lone enemies. And in my view at least, they were, at the end of the day, very evenly matched. This stalemate is not offset by their physical capabilities, as would be the case with Plo Koon and Obi-Wan Kenobi. The physiologies of Saesee Tiin and Kit Fisto merely serve as enhancements to their personal fighting styles. Tiin, the terrifying powerhouse, and Fisto, the agile speed fencer. What I see is the defining element in this contest is their force abilities, as they are so evenly matched everywhere else. Despite Saesee Tiin's raw power, Kit Fisto is a significantly more committed combative force wielder. While Tiin has his share of using the Force in a more subtle and creative manner, the majority of his observed applications have been very blunt and straightforward. Telekinetic shoves to stagger his opponents, or advanced Force throws to pummel them with loose objects. Nothing more. While Kit Fisto's Jedi consular mentality, combined with his tendency to release himself into the currents of the Force, has worked against him as a martial artist, they are very much his advantage when it comes to his Force abilities. Fisto's more calculating approach and creative applications provide him with options, whereas Tiin's basic brutality, however potent it may be, does not. As far as how this battle would play out, I would say the most apt comparison would be the second duel between Darth Malgus and Satele Shan on Alderaan, and I'll just leave it up to you to deduce who stands in for whom. The fight would begin as a pure lightsaber duel, and the two would stand evenly matched in the initial engagement. While anything could happen in a lightsaber duel, and it is entirely possible that Saesee could overpower Fisto before he could resort to his combative Force abilities, chances are that Kit Fisto would be able to fall back on these powers and overwhelm Saesee Tiin. I declare Kit Fisto the winner. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this latest installment of the Versus Series Season 5. As always, you are free to... Oh. Hey, Saesee, you're, not upset that you lost the match, right? I mean, I know this was the first time you've ever been featured, so I get being upset, but there's no reason to... Saesee? Oh boy.
Ah!